My husband promised a New Year's surprise, but he took me to his toxic parents who mocked my looks, so I gave them a gift that shattered their lives. My husband, a 42-year-old male, and I, a 44-year-old female, had been married for 16 years. We have 2 twin daughters who are 13 years old. My husband and I have had a relatively happy marriage, except for our relationship with his parents. We haven't been on speaking terms with my in-laws, both of whom are in their early 60s, for almost 7 years now. My in-laws are literally the worst people I've ever met in my entire life, and I hate them from the bottom of my heart. They hate me too, as far as I know, and what's worse is they seem to hate their grandkids as well. I hate to say it, but they'll pretty much bully anything and anyone they don't like. They never liked me, so as a result, they don't like our kids either. Their reason for not liking me is pretty shallow, and I'll be blunt about it, they dislike me for my weight. I've always been a big girl, even as a kid, and I've been mocked about it for ages, so this isn't new to me. It's not something I can control either. I just have big bones. Even though I go to the gym and everything, I'm on the heavier side. It's just how I'm built and has nothing to do with my diet, exercise, or overall health. I'm a healthy person and can do everything that everyone else can, but the only difference is that my appearance is a little bigger compared to the average American woman. My in-laws have never liked that and made it a point to point it out every time my husband would bring me over for dinner to their house while we were dating. They cut it out after a while, presumably after my husband spoke to them about the little digs they'd take at me because I told them about the first couple of meetings and how I didn't appreciate them making comments regarding my weight. So, they stopped talking about it, but instead, they found other ways to get under my skin, like making bland and tasteless food in small portions that would barely feed a kid whenever I'd visit. Their excuse was that apparently, they were getting old and needed to watch what they ate, but they were in their 40s at the time, so I didn't buy that they were too old to have normal food. They didn't need to watch what they ate, they wanted me to do so. The food they prepared for me, along with the portions they served, was just their subtle way of reminding me that they didn't like this about me. Of course, along with my appearance, there were several other things they didn't like about me either. They didn't like where I came from since my parents are cattle farmers from Minnesota, while my in-laws have their own business, are a lot better off than my family, and are more urban, or whatever. I'm also kind of shrill, so my mother-in-law would often make faces whenever I got too excited about something while talking to them and then put a finger in her ear to show that I'd been too loud. It was all these little subtle things that really got to me, but I still didn't say anything since I didn't want them to have another excuse to hate me, like maybe I was too sensitive for them. So, I learned to be less myself whenever I was around them. My husband just kept apologizing for it over and over again, but he never left his parents either. Then we got married, and his parents started disliking me even more than they already did. The jibes at me started getting less and less subtle. It stopped for a while when I was pregnant, but after the birth of my daughters, they returned to their original form. My daughters are also like me, they're big-boned. Even though they're completely healthy, they're also kind of big. When they were babies, they were really chubby, so nobody could tell, but as they grew older, it became clear that they'd taken after me when it came to their body. I didn't mind it since my grandmother, mother, and I were all built the same way, so this runs in my family, and I'd been expecting it. So had my husband. But for some reason, my in-laws were surprised that our daughters weren't the petite and skinny grandkids they'd been expecting. They'd already made a lot of fun of me during my pregnancy since I was really big, which was obviously because I was carrying twice the number of babies. Right after the kids were born, they came after me and started bugging me about losing the pregnancy weight. They would constantly bother me with tips that I never asked for and that I'm sure were no good anyway. Then, a couple of years after the kids were born, they started bullying the kids when they were literally just 5 or 6 years old. They'd tell the kids that they'd grow up to be fat monsters if they didn't stop eating and actually scared them into refusing food. They also tried to teach my daughters to be soft-spoken by glaring at them every time they dared to laugh a little too loudly or shriek with joy, which is not something that a kid should be rebuked for. A couple of years passed like that until I finally had enough of it. It was disgusting, and it got to a point where I just couldn't put up with their behavior anymore. I told my husband that he could either cut ties with his parents, or I'd leave with the kids because this wasn't the kind of environment I wanted them to grow up in, where they were not allowed to do anything they wanted and were not even allowed to be kids. Up until that point, every time I talked to my husband about these things, he promised me that he'd talk to his parents and make it all right. But I'd had enough, and his parents were clearly not inclined to change their behavior, so I had to give him that ultimatum. That's when he finally confronted his parents for good. They ended up getting into the nastiest spat with him, and that was it. We didn't speak after that. It's been 7 years since then, and we act like they never existed at all. My children are also better off for it. But then, 3 days ago, on New Year's Eve, my husband told me that he was going to take me and the kids to this great new place, but he wanted to keep it a surprise, so we didn't ask more about it. We dressed up and left toward the evening, and we were all excited since we thought we'd be going to a new restaurant or something like that. But soon enough, I realized that the route we were following was the one that led to his parents' house. It had been 7 years, and we'd moved around quite a bit, but I could still recognize that neighborhood. As soon as it hit me, I told my husband to pull over, and he obeyed, probably because he'd sensed that I'd realized what was going on. The two of us got out of the car so the kids wouldn't be able to hear anything, and then I totally tore into him for lying to us and trying to manipulate us into visiting his parents even after all that had happened. He explained to me that his parents had contacted him just a couple of weeks ago to apologize for their behavior in the past and that, since his mother had just been diagnosed with stage 3 liver cancer, she really wanted to make everything right before it was too late. He had tears in his eyes while telling me all of this and even showed me the chats where his parents had apologized. He told me that if I didn't want to come with him even after this, he'd be okay with it, but he just wanted me to think about all of this with a cool head and reconsider. From the texts, it was pretty evident that his parents were actually desperate to see him, the kids, and even me, which was surprising since I never thought they'd ever want to meet me. My husband even called them to convince me, and when I spoke to them on the phone, they were pleading and begging me to come see them. So, I felt bad and agreed that we could go see them just this once, only because they were so desperate, and it sounded like they were actually willing to make amends this time around. It had been 7 years anyway, and my kids were older, so, I even asked them, once we were back in the car, if they wanted to see their grandparents. We were transparent with them and told them that their grandma was sick, so she didn't have much time, but if they didn't want to visit her, we'd drop them home. After some hesitation, the girls agreed as well, and so we resumed our drive. In hindsight, I probably should have just taken a cab back home with the girls and left it at that. Once we got to my in-laws' house, I started getting a really bad feeling, but my husband looked thrilled. He had a tearful reunion with his parents before either of them paid any attention to us. To my surprise, my mother-in-law didn't look sick in the slightest, which was very odd because I don't think anyone with stage 3 cancer of any kind looks like that. She didn't even seem weak or anything, in spite of her claims that she'd been undergoing chemo for months now and had been in and out of the hospital ever since her diagnosis. Neither had she lost any of her hair, which seemed like a huge red flag for me. But I wasn't about to just walk in and accuse my mother-in-law of lying about her cancer so she could see her son, so I kept quiet. Again, I should have said something, but I didn't, and that's my fault. My in-laws welcomed me and the kids inside after they were done hugging and celebrating the return of their son. My heart dropped when I noticed that neither of them was smiling the way they were when they saw their son come back. Instead, while welcoming me and their grandkids, they were smirking, and it made me uncomfortable. I still ignored it somehow, and then we went inside the house. But after that, we were as good as invisible to my in-laws. They ignored us and only chatted with their son while my kids and I just sat in the corner and tried not to bring ourselves into the spotlight because nothing about this entire interaction was pleasant to us. It went on for a couple of hours, and then, around 11 to midnight, my in-laws finally included us in the conversation and told us that they had something for my daughters. They said it very sweetly, and I was almost convinced that this was going to go well and everything would be just fine. They brought out a square-looking gift wrapped in the general shape of a box, so we didn't know what it could contain. My daughters unwrapped it excitedly as soon as they got their hands on it, and when they finally brought out the gift, their faces fell, and so did mine. It was a bloody weighing machine that they gifted my 13-year-old daughters. I flipped out as soon as I saw it. My daughters had already been shamed their entire lives by people around them who didn't know any better, like folks at school or sometimes even teachers. They really didn't need this. I freaked out and started screaming at them. I don't even remember the things I said, but it was pretty bad if I'm going by what my husband said. I might have even cursed them out right in front of the kids. Thankfully, even my husband didn't appreciate the so-called gift, and we stormed out right after my meltdown. He didn't even wait to hear them out, even though they kept yelling for him to wait for them. He just continued walking until we reached the car and then drove off. I was extremely pissed off at my husband, even though he kept apologizing over and over again and kept saying that he didn't know his parents would do something like this. My daughters were pretty upset as well, but they stayed silent, and we unfortunately had to begin our new year in the car, fighting like crazy. I didn't hold back that day and let it all out in one go because I was really upset and had no control over what I was saying to my husband. I told him that he'd never once stood up for me or even his kids when it came to his parents, except for one time all those years ago. Even now, he went running back to them just because they'd made some crap up about his mother suffering from cancer or whatever, which frankly didn't even look like it was true. Worst of all, He'd lied to me about all of this and manipulated me into coming here with the kids just for us to be insulted, while he happily chatted away with his parents and ignored the way they didn't engage with us in conversation even once. I accused him of being indifferent to us and putting his parents over his family. But then he protested and said that it wasn't fair of me to say that since he had cut his parents off and hadn't spoken to them for 7 years just because they tried to bully me and his daughters. But then I brought up how he'd allowed that to happen for years before he finally cut ties with them. He told me that he loved his parents as much as he loved us and wanted to give them a second chance. That was also his excuse for what he did on New Year's Eve. He said that my accusations were hurtful and unfair since he just wanted to make amends with his aging parents, especially his mother, since he believed that she wouldn't be around for much longer. He admitted that it was a mistake for us to go there to see them and that he was a fool for falling for their act, but he maintained that he wasn't putting his parents over his family, and that was the truth. Now, we've been fighting over this ever since we had that conversation, and I don't understand what to say or do. My parents think I was a little too harsh, but they agree with the things I said, though. So, I'm totally lost right now. We live in the same house, and we cannot avoid each other forever, so there has to be an answer to all of this. That's why I'm here right now. So, people of Reddit, am I the asshole for accusing my husband of putting his parents over his wife and kids after he lied and took us to his toxic parents' house to reconcile? It's been a week since New Year's, and this has been the longest time we've gone without speaking to one another. The girls had a sleepover at a friend's place, so we had the house to ourselves after we came back home from work. He asked me if I was willing to talk. I said yes out of relief because I thought he was going to apologize to me, but that wasn't what happened. Instead, he told me that he was still really hurt about what I had told him the other day in the car because he strongly feels that he's never put his parents and his relationship with them above the emotional well-being of his children. Once again, he brought up how he'd severed ties with them 7 years ago because of all the bullying and stuff. He added the recent incident, saying that he also hasn't talked to his parents after what happened on New Year's Eve. I was really tired from work, and I told him that it didn't matter because it was literally the bare minimum after everything that had happened. His parents were horrible people, but he continued to entertain their behavior for years before he finally worked up the courage to cut them off. In doing so, he put me and his daughters through a lot while he kept putting off having such an important discussion with his parents regarding their disturbing behavior. He argued with me, saying that if I'd been in his place, then I would have done the same thing because it wasn't easy for him to cut off his parents. That was a totally hypothetical situation because it wasn't me in his place. He's the one who had to make the call on what to do about his parents, not me, so that didn't even make sense to me. But for the sake of argument, I told him that had it been my parents who were acting this way with my spouse and children, then I wouldn't have had to think twice before letting them go. I didn't care what anyone else would think of me because, for me, my own family outweighs everyone else. To be honest, my parents would never act like this anyway because that's not the kind of people they are. If they had turned out to be such nasty people, then I would have cut them off in a heartbeat. When I said that to my husband, he got all defensive and told me that it was easy for me to say because I wasn't in the same position as he was. He was right, I wasn't because my parents are decent, loving people and don't go around bullying people for their appearance. We ended up fighting over this, and now I don't know if we can go back from this anymore. It was ridiculous the way he was going out of his way to defend his relationship with his parents, even though he knew he'd screwed up. I'd stayed with him so long because I didn't want to give up on our relationship over disagreements with my in-laws and because I loved him more than myself. But now, it's not the same for me, and there are kids involved. I'd stayed with him in the past too, even after the kids were born, because I didn't want to drag them into a custody battle when they were so young. They're older now, and hopefully, if my marriage falls apart, they'll be able to deal with it better emotionally because I can't see any way out of this. Whether or not both of us end up on the same page, he and I really can't see eye to eye on this, and this is kind of a major thing. We can get over all our minor petty arguments, but this is something I cannot just move on from so easily. If I'm being really honest, even if he comes around and apologizes to me, tells me that he was wrong and he screwed up, even then, I don't think I'll be able to go back to seeing him the same way I used to. In these past few years, I feel like I've become a doormat, and I'm being pushed around by everyone. Sometimes it's my husband, sometimes it's my kids, and sometimes it's my own parents. Everyone's just constantly telling me what I have to do and getting mad if I disagree. I can't keep everyone happy, and it's about time I learn that, even if it has to be the hard way. I'm just really sick and tired of whatever is going on right now, and I need a break. I love my husband, or at least I used to. I don't know how I feel about him right now. I love my daughters, but they're in their angsty teen phase right now and get mad at me over the smallest things. They're also embarrassed by me and seem to want to hide me away all the time. I get that all teens go through this phase, but I still feel sorry for myself because these are my babies. Even my parents can be kind of overwhelming sometimes, so that's also a thing. I've just been very lost for the last couple of years, and now I want to do what's best for myself. My husband left after the fight and told me that he'd be spending the night at a friend's place until he cooled off, and I didn't try to stop him either. After I'm done with this post, I'm going to run a hot shower, pour myself some wine, and put on some tacky reality TV show that I'll watch until I fall asleep on the couch. I need a break, and this is what I'm going to do for myself now. I'm done. The house was unusually quiet that morning when my husband and children returned. Typically, by 7 o'clock, I'm a whirlwind in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, packing lunchboxes, and orchestrating the morning chaos with practiced ease. But today, at 10, I was still curled up on the couch, tangled in a throw blanket, lost in the kind of deep sleep that comes from exhaustion. The sound of the front door creaking open and the familiar chatter of my kids startled me awake. I blinked against the sunlight streaming through the living room window, my mind sluggish as I registered their surprised faces. My husband, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, didn't say much, but his expression spoke volumes, part confusion, part irritation. He mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd taken the day off work, so my oversleeping wasn't a big deal. The kids, it turned out, had been at a sleepover, and their school was closed for an official holiday, which explained their unexpected return. He ushered them to their rooms with a quick instruction to unpack and settle in, leaving the two of us alone in the kitchen. Breakfast was a quiet affair, just the two of us at the table, me nibbling on a hastily made sandwich and him sipping coffee, his jaw tight. The silence between us was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. His eyes, usually warm, were clouded with something I couldn't quite place, anger, maybe, or frustration. I didn't ask. I didn't feel like poking at whatever was simmering beneath the surface. Instead, I focused on the crust of my sandwich, chewing slowly, letting the silence stretch. The day moved forward in its usual rhythm, or at least as close to it as we could manage. The kids, oblivious to the undercurrent between their parents, went about their activities, playing games, scrolling on their tablets, laughing over some shared joke. I tried to lose myself in the normalcy of it all, tidying up, answering emails, and pretending everything was fine, but the weight of that morning's silence lingered, like a storm cloud hovering just out of sight. Around 3 in the afternoon, I was on the phone with a friend, laughing at some silly story she was telling, when my husband approached. His voice cut through my conversation, sharp and impatient. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I held up a finger, asking him to wait just a moment while I wrapped up my call. But he wasn't having it. "I'm not waiting," he snapped, his words slicing through the air. "What I have to say is more important than some chat with your friend." The irritation in his voice was like a spark to kindling, igniting something in me I'd been suppressing for too long. I ended the call abruptly, my friend's voice fading mid-sentence, and turned to face him. Before he could launch into whatever he wanted to say, I cut him off. "You need to watch how you speak to me," I said, my voice steady but firm. His brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face, but I wasn't done. "I'm not your doormat anymore. Not yours, not anyone's. If you can't respect me, respect what I want, then there's no point in talking at all." The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, years of frustration distilled into a single moment. What followed was a storm of an argument, the kind that leaves you breathless and drained. He insisted he'd been polite, that I was overreacting, too sensitive, blowing things out of proportion. I held my ground, refusing to let his version of events overwrite mine. The conversation spiraled, veering away from whatever he'd originally wanted to discuss. It became a battle of perspectives, each of us digging in, unwilling to yield. By the end, he stormed out of the house, the door slamming behind him. He didn't say where he was going, and I didn't ask. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the kids playing in their rooms. Dinner that evening was subdued. My daughters ate quietly, their usual chatter absent. I was grateful they didn't ask about their father's absence. I wouldn't have known what to say. The weight of the day settled over me as I tucked them into bed, their small forms curled under blankets, blissfully unaware of the fracture widening between their parents. I sat in the living room afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten here. 2 weeks later, the reality of our situation began to solidify. My husband had been staying with a friend, and the distance between us felt both strange and necessary. We met up a couple of days ago, sitting across from each other at a coffee shop, the air between us less charged than before. For the first time in a long time, we talked like adults, not as adversaries, but as two people trying to navigate the end of something that had once meant everything. We both admitted what we'd been avoiding for years: our marriage wasn't working. It hadn't been for longer than either of us cared to admit. The love that had once bound us had frayed, worn thin by countless arguments, unspoken resentments, and unmet expectations. We agreed to separate, mutually and without malice. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about acknowledging that staying together was making us, and our children, miserable. Splitting up felt like the only way to give everyone a chance at happiness, or at least peace. We talked about the logistics, co-parenting, schedules, how to explain it to the kids. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. When we told our daughters, I braced for tears or questions, but they surprised me with their quiet acceptance. Maybe they'd sensed the tension all along. Maybe they were just too young to fully grasp what it meant. Either way, their calm response felt like a small mercy, a sign that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Looking ahead, I'm cautiously hopeful. The kids will need time to adjust, and so will I. There's a part of me that mourns what we had, or what I thought we had, but there's also a strange sense of freedom in letting go. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm grateful for the clarity we've found, for the chance to start over, separately but with mutual respect. I want to thank those who've offered advice and support along the way. It's meant more than I can say. Here's to hoping things turn out okay, for all of us.